I first encountered Dougald as a presence rather than a person. And it was an event organized by Pat Kane. And I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, 2012 or possibly 2011 in the UK. And what I remember most was Dougald's quite tall. I don't know exactly how tall Dougald, but I'm guessing you're 6'3" or something like that. And Dougald also had very long hair at the time. And he stood up with his beard and his long hair. I think he even had boots on at the time. And the reason I remember this is that the comment was this. He suddenly said, like a bolt of lightning, first of all, who is this guy? And secondly, the line was, the reason we're all tired is that we're living off the battery of the ego and we're not plugged into any metaphysical means. And it was a real sort of juggernaut of a thought. And I thought, gosh, I need to find out who that is. And I listened a bit subsequently, and we spoke not very much, but a little bit now and again in the ensuing years. And then a few months back, when his book was coming out, I got sent a copy before it came out. And it's not quite true to say I read it in one sitting, but it's close. I read in two sittings. The first two chapters or so made me realize I really wanted to read this book. And then one Saturday night, I began at about 6 o'clock in the evening and went into about 2 a.m. in the morning. And I emailed Dougald the next day and said, great book, love it. I mean, there were moments where I was keen to speak further, but by and large, I totally bought into the account of it. It's called At Work in the Ruins. I have it here. And I'm doing this partly so that you'll all be so kind as to, this is actually I think a proof copy, if I'm not mistaken. So do go ahead and buy it. I can also recommend Dougald's Substack called Writing Home, which will be quite easy to find. And I think if I were to sort of improvise a biography of Dougald, it would be something like storyteller would come up quite quickly. I want to say philosopher, but there's quite a lot of historian in there. There's certainly a quality of vitality and conviviality. There's definitely convening energy. So Dougald is known, among other things, for co-creating the Dark Mountain project, which I'll leave Dougald to explain in one of his answers, but in essence was a real effort to build community around something like telling the ecological truth and what follows from it. And subsequently, he's had projects including a school called Home. He now lives with the family in Sweden, and he can speak further about that as well. And I believe there's a background in journalism and many writings along the way, including the sort of editorial function of the Dark Mountain project, which often included many books. So that's my kind of like sketchy how I pieced together my picture of Dougald. A very strong first impression, an awareness of a very interesting biography, a reckoning of commonality and common interest in the book, and an excitement about where he's at today with all of his different projects. And that's the context in which I want to begin with my first inquiry, Dougald. So I want to, if I had time, we may not get through all of these things, but I realized I want to ask you something about modernity ending and what that means. Something about the actual feeling of these projects, Dark Mountain and School Called Home. I'm interested in, as a sort of slight critique or challenge about when we speak of we and the situation we're in and the world's in, if you ever have doubts about the extent to which you're speaking really on behalf of the world and the extent to which it's a relatively niche part of that world. I'm curious to know a bit more about Ivan Illich, because I feel he's someone you know really well, and maybe our perspecteeva community doesn't know well enough. But I want to start with something altogether juicier and more difficult, which is that two of your friends and colleagues in recent months have somewhat surprisingly sort of come out as Christians. So Paul Kingsnorth, especially, and Martin, Martin, I forget the second name momentarily. And I've noticed in recent conversations you've been wrestling with that a bit in an interesting way, because it feels to me like part of you is very curious, and I'm wondering if you're going that way too, and I'm wondering what follows. I know that I can give a little bit of testimony here. When a friend of mine became Christian a few years ago, I felt very sad. I felt, oh my God, now you can't be anything else. Like as if somehow to become for this person to become Christian was somehow to that would his primary identity, and from there on in, all of these other dimensions of his character would somehow be subsumed by it. I know that's not how it has to work, but for what it's worth, I noticed that, and I'm in a similar place. The kind of growing return and curiosity towards it, with still a certain amount of weariness and a fear of being subsumed. So that's the first question. Where are you with the very biggest question? And then we'll come to the smaller things later.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, what struck me in the way that you asked the question was that kind of concern about Christianity as identity. And I think that, I mean, it's been fascinating for me, and actually, quite sort of heartwarming to see both Paul, who had no background or history with Christianity at all, and Martin, who had grown up around various flavors of, evangelical kind of Pentecostal, kind of quite far out Christianities, and then very much rejected that while still a teenager. And neither of those were my story. But to see these two friends, two men who have, extraordinary gifts and, extraordinary cultural impact on these journeys over the last 3 years. Now, I spent the first 3 years of my life living in the grounds of a theological college. So some might say that I've never recovered, but this was, my dad was, until he retired, a United Reformed Church minister. This was the environment I grew up in. And unlike Martin, I didn't experience a sort of teenage walking away from it. But I did experience, around the time I turned 30, a very distinct sense of release from any kind of obligation to Christianity as an identity.
Right.
And it was quite a freeing thing that, was connected to me both with the point where I began to have a public voice, and also that kind of energy that you were picking up on when we crossed paths the first time back in 2011, it would have been. And it's funny that you remember that line about why we're so tired. It's a classic example of when I say we, I mean I.
Right.
I was heading hard and fast into a burnout at the time of that event. And in the way that you sometimes can be when you go through sort of phases where your life burns down, some deep truth comes out of the smoking ruins of it. So, I guess I remain grounded in Christianity as where I come from, and kind of intrigued by the greater space that there is than there was 5 years ago, for there to be anything useful from that to bring to the table in the kinds of places where I find myself. And at the same time, I think that, the last thing that the world needs would be for me to kind of turn into another theology bro on YouTube. But I do find myself, more and more getting a lot of juice and a lot of life from my engagement with Christian theology, having gone through a long time after that experience when I was 30, where I didn't need very much from there, and I wasn't finding myself very often in dialogue with it.
Right. That's useful to hear. And I think you'd make a very good theology bro, by the way. Not that you have to become one. I started there at the deep end just because it's interesting to try and, make sense of what kind of a person you are. And by that, I mean the sort of personal, professional, metapolitical, I want to say, quasi-spiritual space that you occupy. It isn't something that lends itself to an easy job description, right?
No.
um, as you know. But how would you self-define yourself? How would you make sense of who you are? How would you say when someone asks you outside of these sort of networks, what do you do? How do you answer?
When I need to give a one-word answer, I say I'm a writer. And for years, my writer friends would kind of prod me and go, "You can't say that. You haven't written a proper book." As my words were spread out in all sorts of different places. And so having written at Work in the Ruins has made it a little easier to pull that off. But
Right.
I say that because I think words and working with words um, it's my medium,
Yeah.
in the same way that a carpenter works with wood. And I I had a very fortuitous encounter with David Abram quite early in Dark Mountain because I'd already read The Spell of the Sensuous, and then he wrote to us saying how much our manifesto spoke to him, and that he sort of felt a bit less isolated in what he was doing because of what we
Right.
were doing. And when we met up, I remember coming away from that, realizing that you could work with words without sharing the default assumption about the hierarchy of the written and the spoken that
Right.
is operating most of the time in the cultures that you and I were
Right.
born and bred and educated into.
Right.
So, for want of a better word, I'm a writer, but I put as much weight on the speaking of words as the putting of them on
But
paper.
also the creation of institutions and journals and you know,
Yes,
the speaking at events is not a sideline, right? It's kind of part of what you do.
absolutely. Well, sort of bringing people together around the table. And
Right.
that's really,
Right.
conviviality was a word you used at the beginning, which is a very much an Ivan Illich
Right.
word.
Right.
And so really the institutions tend to be pocket-sized institutions, even if
Right.
sometimes they have, a larger impact, but it's very much, what grows out of and returns to the kind of fellowship around the table,
But
which
how
again,
do you?
you
Hmm.
could, if you want to, you can definitely see a kind of a theological or ecclesiological history behind that understanding of the fellowship of the table.
Right. And yet, I'm still curious to understand when someone says you're a writer and they ask what you write about.
Mm.
Like the what I'm trying to get clarity on is the entire field that Dark Mountain's about, that Perspective is about, that the Kairos Club in London is now about, and innumerable other organizations have popped up in the last sort of maybe 15 odd years. Um, and I feel there's many people at the street I'm looking out on now who just don't know that world exists at all. So how would you describe what that kind of world is? What is your domain or
Mm.
field or um, arena, let's say?
Um, I guess it's people who are trying to navigate in the difference between the world as we've known it and the world full stop.
Right,
That's one of the closing lines of the manifesto Paul and I wrote
right.
15 years ago. We said, the end of the world as we know it is not the same thing as the end of
Mm-hmm.
the world full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And people tend to find their way to my work or to the things that I'm part of creating because some kind of experience has brought them to a questioning of assumptions. Often, not always, it has been being shaken by climate change as, an existential crisis rather than just a problem that can be solved and made to go away or made manageable.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not always from that direction. And so then the questions that I work with, and I think the questions that are alive in the spaces that you're naming as well, are, well, okay, how do we make sense of this? How did we find ourselves here? Which is why history becomes an important part of the mix. What is worth doing, given what we know and what we have good grounds to fear? How do we how do any of us locate ourselves in relation to those questions, starting from here rather than starting from everywhere and nowhere?
Mm-hmm.
as in the answer to the what is worth doing question is not, as it's often framed, what do we need to do, as if we all sit down and have some kind of consensus decision-making process and arrive at a collective answer.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we answer starting from where we find ourselves in collaboration with those we're in relation with.
Right.
And so I'm interested in, out of my own needs and out of the place where they seem to meet others' needs, in creating spaces where we can explore all of that without either there being a kind of rush to answers and to action, or there being a sort of black certainty about it all being over and there being nothing worth trying. And I think that it's that sort of the space in between those two, the space in which the things that might be worth trying change us, rather than us operating from existing understandings of self and agency, framing problems and identifying solutions and so on.
Right.
That's the space that where I'm at home.
Right. And so am I, for what it's worth. And I find one way I think about it these days is, particularly on the climate crisis, I actually have more faith or more hope, and both of those terms need defining, but in something like a transformation of perspective and consciousness at scale, new ways of living, new ways of perceiving the world, metanoia, that kind of fundamental shift of perspective, albeit it might be quite subtle, it might be quite slow, it might be quite oblique and indirect, but nonetheless a radically different view of the world than the prevailing imaginary that we live with. I have more faith in that than I do in a kind of making do and mend with existing institutions. And that's why what looks like deviant or niche work, for those who are doing it, often feels like the only work to be doing, because you're, as you put it so eloquently, or I know you maybe have taken it from somewhere, but literally at work in the ruins, right? Tell me more about the ruins, though, because going back to Dark Mountain, there's an intuition that you seem to have, and that I have, and that many people here have, and you eloquently put it somewhere, that, quoting someone, that we're often born into a world that is ending. Tell me more about that, going back to Dark Mountain, and then how it's moved into your current thinking, and in the book especially.
Yeah. So those words about being born into the ending of a world, they came to me from Federico Campagna, who's a very interesting philosopher. His work is quite challenging, and I feel like I've kind of found myself as this oral storyteller, carrying certain bits that I've found there in a different register to perhaps what you'll find in his books. But I sat down and told it to him across a table in London, and he said, "No, you've got it right," which was encouraging. So for me, I mean, obviously we need to start by acknowledging that there are people who are in ruins literally right now.
Right.
And you're sat there with your piano behind you, and I'm sat there with the pumpkins from our garden behind me. We are clearly sitting in pretty sheltered places. And yet I think that, certainly my work is animated by a sense that modernity, for all of the gifts carried within it, has both come to a place where it is it's on its way to becoming its own ruin. We're already partway into the process of the ruining of modernity, of a kind that can't be patched up to take us back to the best achievements of the 30 glorious years after the Second World War, or wherever we choose to locate the high points of modernity, but also that modernity was founded on ruin, both ecologically and culturally, and that even through the high era of modernity, when we were in the middle of the story of the world of modernity rather than at the end of it, as I suspect we find ourselves, its story was bound up with a particular arrogance, a particular kind of developmental narrative, which again has theological roots, which allowed it to tell the story of the destruction of every other world it came into contact with as a story of progress.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a sense in which one of the gifts of being at a time of endings is that the angle of the light throws into relief things that couldn't be seen clearly when the sun was shining from directly overhead. The owl of Minerva flies at dusk, and that, things that were cast into shadow or things that were hidden from view, while it all looked like it worked, become easier for even those of us who've been the winners of modernity to begin to catch sight of.
Mm.
Therefore, it might be possible to begin to hear things which people who have been living among ruins made by modernity while we were enjoying its benefits have been trying to say to us for a long time. And that's, part of what's going on in the book.
Mm.
Is a kind of listening to and being in dialogue with a lot of voices who have been on the receiving end of projects of modernization in a way that gives a different perspective,
right,
to the vantage points of, Stockholm or London or Paris.
Right. So you articulate all of that wonderfully in the book, and I can't emphasize to those who haven't read it just how well Dougald tells that story and brings those voices in. But I'm also thinking of one voice that I came to know better through a link in even a footnote of one of your Substack posts. It was the Bruno Latour critique, or sort of friendly critique, of ecomodernism.
Mm.
In ecomodernism, for those who don't know, are broadly those people who think that the ecological problems of the world can be solved with more modernity, effectively, scientific progress, economic growth, and thereby using the technological gains to decarbonize, and so it goes on. Bruno Latour gives quite a sharp critique of that, saying they haven't reckoned with the fact that we're actually in a new phase of geological time, and they're basically deluded, I think, is roughly what he argues. But there's a line in there that really grabbed me. Because they have modern in their title, he says, look, modernity is a concept, not something that happened. Modernity is a concept, not something that happened. And I was grappling with this a bit vis-a-vis the notion of modernity ending. Like, what exactly are we talking about here? Are we, first of all, it's a large historical epoch of some hundreds of years. You can tell me roughly how many hundreds. But secondly, that is a conceptual framing rather than an event or even a process necessarily. So when we say modernity, what are we referring to? And also, what do we mean when we say it's ending?
Well, I think that, and Alfie can correct me if I'm wrong,
yeah.
I think that what we might be talking about, and this might be the meeting point with Latour, is the ending of a story, the point where a story that sounded convincing and that was powerful enough to do a lot of things that then arrive in the world, that the point at which that story no longer rings true to very many people who wouldn't find themselves in a conversation like this, but just a kind of ground level experience of what it's like to be alive in lots of places just now.
Right. Well, and I'm glad to know Alfie's there to check you on this, but I want to know a little more about that. So you said in one of your talks that Illich, and there's a chance to bring him in here, notices modernity earlier than most people. That most people would locate it sometime around 1600, give or take. But Illich goes back quite a bit further to debates on transubstantiation and the difference between you can explain it better than me, but in essence, there's a moment at which the idea of something and the reality of something are separated, and he puts that back in some 12th century reference, I think.
So I mean, if we want to go right down to the roots, then Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, in her book Hospicing Modernity, which I can't recommend enough, sort of does a nice layering of the sort of depths of modernity, where parts of it are going right back to or it has roots which are tapping into classical Greek
Right.
philosophy, for example. So yes, when we tend to talk about modernity from the point of the self-consciousness of modernity, which I identify as, you know, the point at which you have a group of people who start to take it as self-evident that our proximity to the future, or that their proximity to the future, is their defining feature and might be the defining feature of the times in which they're living. And so that places you into the sort of really into the 18th century, perhaps late 17th. But you know, what Illich does is to locate 3 centuries prior to the Reformation, the really important changes that were taking place in the Western Church, that are in many ways the sort of I think he makes a really strong argument in The Rivers North of the Future for why it would be worth kind of focusing the lens on that time depth to see, you know, to see a lot of what's happening later as a playing out of a kind of fundamental rupture that's going on about, you know, a millennium into the sort of history of European Christianity, which, as you say, you know, he sort of puts his finger on this. You know, he basically says, how come for the first time in about the 12th century do we get controversies over what's actually happening in the Eucharist? How did we go 10 centuries or more with this, not like the thing that becomes this recurring conflagration up until the Reformation and beyond, of, you know, is there a kind of material transformation of the bread and the blood, or is it a symbolic, you know, kind of metaphorical thing that's going on? How did no one kind of tear each other apart over that for 1,000 years? And he says, I think what we've got here is a clue that something, a kind of split is going on the far side of which what seems like common sense to us about the distinction between the literal and the metaphorical just doesn't make sense to people.
Right.
And I think you could then put that together with the way that somebody like Gordon White in his Animistic is really, you know, inviting us into a kind of cross-cultural dialogue that gets beyond the sort of the place where postmodernism left us, of not being able to suspect that there is anything like universal behind the differences that are obviously there between our cultures, and notice some similar cross-cultural strangenesses to the cross-historical strangeness that Illich is pointing to in that moment.
Right. Oh. Are you okay with Alfie there? Do you need to do anything?
Yes,
or...
Alfie, you're welcome to go upstairs and help yourself to a dream. That's okay. That's okay.
So I want to stay with this notion of ruins because it's so central to your book and central to what we're talking about here, because I noticed when I share these thoughts with others that there's a certain amount of incredulity. I mean, you mentioned the piano and the pumpkins, but more than that, there's this sense of my colleague Ivo, I'm not sure if he's here, but he says, you know, collectively we're living a life that no longer exists.
Nice.
There's this feeling of dissonance caused by relative peace, even prosperity. Yes, lots of disturbing news cycles, but still more or less functional societies. And in that context, to speak of a version of this world ending, not, I take your point, not the whole world ending, not all possible futures ending, but let's say the modernist imaginary, certainly the liberal aspect of the modernist imaginary, somehow running out, that the story doesn't look credible anymore, and there isn't any obvious alternative story to replace it. I guess I just want to put a word in for the skeptic. I want to know how you speak to someone who says, look, yeah, things are, you know, problematic in various ways, but maybe these structures of broadly democratic states and something like a functional free market is as good as we can get. And maybe we really do just have to solve the energy conundrum, maybe have a bit more deliberative democracy, perhaps a universal basic income. We can do it. We can just sort of mend. We can patchwork this issue, and the story of progress will still be there. Those who are in poverty will come out of poverty as they have in India and China and so on. You can imagine how this story goes.
Yeah.
I don't believe it, so I don't sound very convincing, but I'm curious to know how you respond to that.
I'll be honest with you, Jonathan. I don't invest a lot of energy into trying to convince anyone of anything, really. As I said to you earlier, I see the work that I do as being far more about creating spaces in which we can make sense of what is going on, and sure, I might turn out that I'm wrong, and that's sort of not for me to ultimately try and figure out. I don't think I'm that far wrong on this kind of general read on things. Like it's being offered with sincerity, and I can point to, on the one hand, somebody like Nate Hagens and the work that he's doing, mapping out the real kind of the depth of everything that lies behind the kind of glib offer to solve the energy question. And actually, I do tend to spend quite a bit of time looking at food and how we feed ourselves, and looking at that historically and culturally and economically and politically. I'd be very quick to kind of pass people on to somebody like Chris Smage, who has the kind of depth of experience and an authority that I don't have to speak about it. But I think as a place to look at what is at stake, and not least, you look at the, I think, not particularly generative collisions between George Monbiot, who's kind of arrived at a place of a sort of desperate eco-modernism, I think, and Chris's work. And I think that actually, if someone is genuinely, sincerely puzzled, as opposed to kind of committed to a position which makes them want to debate me as an opponent, then I would sort of direct them to, just spend some time looking closely at the assumptions going on and what happens, when the claims being put by different sides around the future of how we're going to feed ourselves meet each other. Because I think that's one of the places in which the importance of the sort of historical and cultural layering that I speak for reveals itself, and in which the, however well-intentioned, the sort of slightly shallow and shrill kind of progress and technology arguments both get pushed to their last, most desperate throw of the dice, and the gaps within those arguments, the false assumptions, the ignorance of what's actually been pretty well shown by research about how we're actually fed today, all kind of bubbles up to the surface. So for someone who's sincerely puzzled, that might be one of the places that I'd invite them to do a bit of reading and talk to some different people who are on different sides within those debates.
Okay. So the first thing that's interesting there is not wasting energy on trying to persuade people who are likely to be unpersuadable, but also the very endeavor of the trying to persuade somehow seems not your thing. That's not really what you're about. You're about maybe the power of invitation and welcome to another way of looking, rather than a forceful attempt to break an alternative, or to refute an alternative, which is intriguing. But the second aspect of that I'm intrigued by is what happens now. Like if let's say you're broadly correct, and okay, modernity, the story of modernity has run out, and therefore what we're facing in the next few years. And here the we is, of course, a question, but the global problematic writ large is that we're looking at a situation in which more and more people begin to realize that the story of modernity is running out. They may even feel it inside, as you do now and as many others do. And they start looking for something like, and is it really a new story? Because whenever I hear a new story, it always seems very glib and facile and somehow thin. And I've also heard, rather inspiringly, Joe Brewer speak instead of the fact that the story hasn't happened yet and it's up to us to create it and tell it as we're making it, rather than somehow getting the whiteboard out and putting the sticky notes on and saying, here's our new story, let's tell it to the world, which is clearly not how it's going to work. It has to be somehow organismic and embedded, and it has to arise from within at some level. So how does this happen? Like, let's say everything you say is true. Talk us through the next few decades.
So, firstly, the answer to this second part of your question actually relates to the first thing that you're pointing out. The declining to invest too much energy in a certain mode of debating opponents is not only a temperamental kind of recognition of where my gifts do and don't lie, but it's also a read on the kind of times that we're in. There's a political analysis implicit within that, which is that to some extent, Karl Polanyi's sort of story of in the Great Transformation, his major work of economic history in the 1940s, where he looks at 19th century in England, the Industrial Revolution, and he says you have this double movement going on. You have his famous one-liner is laissez-faire was planned. So economic liberalism is being imposed actually as a top-down political project, not as the release of some natural set of laws in the way that it ideologically presents itself.
Right.
But meanwhile, you have a counter movement which is improvised from below by people who don't actually have a shared political ideology or are coming from very different places. It's a response to the chaos. It's a response to the fallout of the top-down project that is being perpetrated. And several generations down the line, you can see some of the better achievements of the 20th century rising out of movements that are part of that counter movement that Polanyi is describing. But in that moment that he's talking about, you don't have two choices that can be put alongside each other on the same plane politically as two parties on opposite sides of the Commons, or as two choices on a ballot paper. And I think that gives a clue to the kinds of strategy that might make sense in a moment like the one we're in as well, which is that what you want to be doing is looking for where you can contribute to the conditions of possibility, where you can improvise stuff that has a chance of working as centralized systems increasingly reveal themselves to be unable to make good on the promises that they still nominally make, the obligations they still legally have upon them. And to me, this goes back to Campagna's Making Good Ruins, because he says, if it is your discernment that you were born into the ending of the world you were born into, that you've arrived at the end of that story, what makes sense? Well, firstly, you can stop worrying quite so much about needing to make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending. So you don't have to worry quite as much about seeming like a grown-up by the standards of that world. But secondly, you can look for ways of making good ruins, of not trying to build things that are finished, but trying to release resources and things that can be put to use from within existing structures. And I was retelling that all over the place for months and months. And gradually it sort of began to dawn on me, talking to people like Nate Hagens, that actually there might be a more strategic interpretation of that, which is, if we look at the resources, which again, a bit like modernity, exist as a sort of semi-fictional thing in our existing economy, these pools of capital of one kind and another, there's a fraction of that which, for one reason or another, is not under the same obligation that, say, the pension funds are, to at least pretend to make sense within the logic of the world that we are currently still inhabiting. And so if you look at, I think it was the Karen Rasmussen Foundation in Denmark, which took a decision to spend down its endowment. And that's a very literal deciding to stop making sense according to the logic of a world which you no longer believe has the future it's claiming to have. And so then that takes you to the question of, well, okay, what do you do with the resources? So firstly, if you have proof of concept, because you can look at Karen Rasmussen or a few other examples of foundations clearly making a decision that they are no longer invested in the futurity of the world that pretends that it will go on working forever, then those resources that are then released from normal behavior, well, they might get channeled into desperate last-ditch attempts to save the world as we know it, which I think is going to look like geoengineering, amongst other things. Or they might get sort of, they might get caught up in what one academic described to me as the sort of game of plastic thrones within an institution where the roof is collapsing, of kind of competing for resources for marginalized groups, but within the logics of modernity. Or if we're lucky, they might actually be able to contribute to this, what I'm calling, after Campania, making good ruins, in the sense of going, okay, like what is there that can support the conditions of possibility for lives worth living as things get more difficult, in collaboration with the people who are holding most knowledge about that, who are often not the people who are marked as the experts on the academic maps or as the most developed people on the maps of the NGOs. And I see lots of examples of that cropping up, and so I'm kind of interested in whether it's possible to join up that set of ideas that I've just been laying out there.
Wow, no, I hear a great deal in that answer, and it's worth just pausing to take it in. I mean, you said to cultivate the conditions of possibility. It's just a sentence, but it is a lot in there. And I've heard this before from other sources about the moving away from the kind of miasma of crisis and crisis management towards a sort of interest in potential and what has potential and getting behind it. But as you spoke there, particularly with regard to philanthropy, because there have been many funds now, Lankelly Chase, if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, also now spending out their endowment because the world that their fund was premised on is ending. So in a sense, you're right. This is actually quite an interesting proxy for people reading the story running out and needing to invest that money in, like you say, it could go towards sort of mad and desperate ecomodernism, or it could go to building good ruins. And that the question for me now then would be, what would that look like? If a significant amount of the world's attention and frankly capital, both political and economic, went towards quote unquote building good ruins, what kinds of things would we observe?
So I'm kind of torn between two lines that would be worth exploring there. One is to just flesh out the cultivating conditions of possibility and what that says about an approach to agency. And it might be worth saying a word about that, because without that piece in there, I think that the answer to the latter part of the question is unlikely to end well. So one of the things that we're dealing with is an idea of agency, or maybe that's too clear, so some background assumptions about agency that are carried over from the story of modernity, which I think, again, are kind of in a strange sense, theological in their roots, because it's like in order to act, the kind of large agencies of modernity, the state, and state-like entities, and in a more complex way, large companies and organizations have been operating with the need to be like a certain way of imagining what it would be like to be God. You know, first step one, omniscience. Step two, omnipotence. So first you seek to know the world from above, and then second you seek to act on it from that, all seeing from above. And I mean, James C. Scott in Seeing Like a State did an important job of kind of tracing some of the histories of that and the patterns of it. So the problem that you then get to, and this is where some of what I'm writing in the book came from, was really, encountering people who were living this problem, because they were much closer than I ever am to the center of existing national and international institutions. And they were arriving at this place of kind of black pessimism over climate change, or worse, sort of cycling between black pessimism and a kind of desperate optimism that does lean into the geoengineering and the rest of it. Because, if you lose your faith in that kind of agency, but you haven't questioned, if you like, the theology that's implicit in that model of agency, then you end up making yourself powerless by the way you've described what power would be like. And so creating conditions of possibility is a way of describing a kind of agency that doesn't seek to know from above, or control outcomes. It comes to me from spending time with Tai Chi teachers, people from the theatre improvisation world. There are all sorts of, as well as from reading anthropology, there are all sorts of sources from which you can begin to build up a picture of what a model of agency in which what you're doing is creating conditions of possibility, rather than seeking to know in advance what the process is, what the outcomes, how you can guarantee the outcomes, and so on. Now, obviously, that's a leap of faith for organizations that have been constituted around modern ideas of agency. But if they're at the point where they're desperate enough to be spending down their endowments, they're already kind of halfway into that leap. So then looking at what's worth doing, well, I'm almost tempted to say you could start with Vinay Gupta's 6 Ways to Die model. Like, start from, what are the things that keep us alive? Then, in a way that isn't necessarily obvious from that model, look at the fact that they are always culturally mediated, that you can't get beneath culture. And actually, in the absence of something worth the name of a living culture, people give up before the conditions of meeting the 6 Ways to Die have been met.
What are the 6 ways of die? I know Vinay quite well, but not his 6 ways to die.
So 6 ways to die. You can be too hot, too cold, hungry, thirsty, sick, or injured. And Vinay's like, show me a way of dying that isn't one of those 6, because I haven't found one yet. And the way it was originally developed was with this simple critical infrastructure mapping, where what you do is you map your dependencies, how far they go out from the individual, household, etc., on each of those 6, to get a picture of what you're really dependent on. Now I'm sort of bringing it in from a different angle to say, what if we have that as a starting point for looking for what we need to create conditions of possibility for. So we need to create conditions of possibility for feeding ourselves, without putting it all on the blockchain, or even assuming that the existing pre-putting it all on the blockchain levels of complexity are going to continue to be reliable. And we need to be embedding it culturally. That is, the approach to doing that needs to be recognizing that human beings whose lives aren't woven through with meaning and with beauty tend to give up even when the conditions of possibility for staying alive, looked at in a purely material sense, are still present.
Right.
So then you could apply that on the rest of the
Yeah.
axes, and you could begin to develop what are the first priorities for what
Right.
we're looking to
Well, I mean, there are other people doing work a bit more sort of metaphysical in nature about first principles and first values, but this is a bit more material. It's more like, um, and Vinay also has, I think, the two major constraints in terms of no slavery condition and a kind of one planet lifestyle condition, in terms of design principles. But again, that is a little bit of the top down mold. But I suppose the point is that even for a bottom up living culture, there will still be some organizing principles and some kind of, you shouldn't fetishize bottom up to such an extent that you have no guiding lights whatsoever. I was curious about one thing there. Somewhere along the way, you were describing the logics of modernity, and I've heard you elsewhere speak about the logic of the market and the state, especially, and that would give rise to who is trustworthy, as in the context of building making good ruins, because who will be trustworthy will probably not be the experts of the present moment, right? As a rule of thumb, those who are functioning and doing well with the logic of the state and the market will not necessarily be the wisest guides to what comes next. And so the question of who to seek for, what expertise looks like in this context where a story is running out, is something more like those who are already telling the new story, a version of the new story, an element of the new story, and beginning to live it in some way that is recognizable. And I suppose I want to ask you, with a line from your book in mind, you say towards the end of chapter 18, look, they're quite good short chapters, by the way, people. They're they're one of these kind of just enough to want you to read the next one kind of size. And you've got a line here: life is not a statistical experience, it is inherently anecdotal. And I suppose with that in mind, I'm curious to understand something of the anecdotes. You mentioned the philanthropy example is powerful because it's so palpable. And something of the anecdotes, what has inspired you in recent months and years? What looks prefigurative to you? What looks like potential?
Yeah. So I'm immediately thinking of people who I actually have, had the chance to get to know because they've taken part in one of the series with our school. They've been part of the long table. And so, on the one hand, I'm thinking of Adam Wilson, who runs the peasantry school, who, they're literally a gift economy farm where
Right.
they were given money to take this property out of the market economy. And he's, telling the story publicly week by week, several years into it now, of this journey of having already been a farmer for 20 years and having taken on this vow, for want of a better word, that none of the food that is grown on their farm will be traded for money. And of then the journey into relationship and community, and the journey of rebuilding and regrowing community in, a very poor area of upstate New York, that that commitment has taken him and those he's working with on.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, in Malaysia, another of our members, Ayaka Fuji, who's in her mid-20s and is part of a project where they've taken over a palm oil plantation. So, you've literally got rainforest that has been through some of the most destructive, exploitative, extractive agriculture, and which they're now in the process of bringing back into life through agroforestry. And I remember two things from one of the first times I heard her talk about being involved with that project. One was how humbling it is to listen to someone 20 years younger than me talking matter-of-factly about how in their project meetings they talk about the fact that they won't be there to see the end of the story that they're embarking on the early stages of. And secondly, a line which I don't know whether it comes from Ayaka originally or someone else within the project, but that I heard from her, which is this kind of recognition that they had that the land is dreaming of being forest, and the people are dreaming of being community. And that, as a tiny poem
Mm.
of what animates these projects that are inspiring me right now, and of the kind of the two-sided nature of the journey from the ecological and cultural ruins that modernity has
Mhm.
made. That does it for me. And
That,
so
that
then,
that's good. I mean, I'm sure you have more to say, and I didn't want to interrupt you, only that my own time is running out here, and I want to get one last question in before it does. Coming back in spirit to the first question, not necessarily the letter of it, but everything you said there about ecological and cultural ruins of modernity, um, the story running out. Um, you began a series on your Substack called Into the Deep, which was a kind of reckoning with the spiritual dimension to this Good Ruins project. What here again, I'm curious, not so much for you to persuade others because you've said already that's not your thing, but somehow when you're having this conversation, is it a given that we need to attend to matters of cosmology and meaning at scale and purpose of human life, and that has to somehow be part of the work that we do now? Or is that rather a source of contestation that will get in the way of the kind of collaborative work we need to do? How do you see it?
I think that um, it's something that's brought more sharply into focus, or the tension is brought more sharply into focus as the sense of the depth of the trouble we're in gets more real. I think that, what I was kind of calling the sort of desperate eco-modernism that I see George Monbiot as, having arrived at, which I think, and I mean, this would be like doing armchair psychology is not recommended, especially if you're not a psychologist. But there is some kind of pattern that seems pretty clear to me between the sort of read on the world that George is operating from and what Ian McGilchrist is describing in terms of
Mm-hmm.
the brain hemispheres. That if that those who are operating from a sort of left hemisphere place have often been kind of willing to indulge a solution of, if you like, Snow's two cultures problem, in which science, which is sort of modeled on a Victorian or 1950s marriage, in which
Right. Yeah.
science
Yeah.
is the kind of the hard practical man, and the arts plays, or culture or whatever plays, the kind of feminine decorative. We wouldn't want to live without it, but we wouldn't want to. You can see the
Yeah.
stereotype.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And I think that you can literally see that in, for example, in the novels of Ian McEwan,
Right.
a staging of that as a solution to Snow's
Yeah.
description. And I think we then see that breaking down as the left hemisphere people go, oh, look, shit's getting serious now. We can't go on flattering you with your fluffy mysticism. You're becoming the enemy by your attachment to it, which is pretty much what George is saying these days. And on the other side, the people who I actually think are doing more rigorous work, such as Chris Smage,
Mhm.
are also completely clear that we can't ignore the cultural dimension of how humans have made life work in all the times and places we know about.
Right.
And I would sort of add to that modernity, one of the aspects of modernity is that it becomes a kind of desert of meaning. Culture, rather than being woven through everything in the way that it's been in pretty much all other times and
Yeah.
places, gets pushed back into this enclave of capital C
Mhm.
culture, the stuff you find in the culture section of the Sunday Times. And meanwhile, the work that is going on, the activity that is going on under the direction of either the logic of the market or the state is being done with less regard to meaning, with less regard to beauty than humans have ever done in any other society we know of.
Mm.
And we don't even have the language or the frame or the lenses from which to see that clearly. But if times are going to get harder, then we won't be able to get away with the kind of cultural poverty that has been endemic in late modern society. And you see people who are trying to reckon with the depth of the trouble we're in, whilst stuck within a kind of modern materialist secular worldview, tend to end up being swallowed by depression.
Right. Right.
Yeah, there's a lot more that I could say about
Yeah,
that.
yeah. No, this is a whole other conversation, but I reminded that, Habermas spoke about modernity's impact on truth, beauty, and goodness being sort of severed, the value spheres being severed, and that part of our challenge now is somehow to bring them together again. And I'm wondering though, you mentioned culture, but not necessarily religion or the metaphysical or the spiritual, all of which mean somewhat different things. It was implicit in your answer that there's scope to go there, but I suppose just as a last question, is it necessary to go there? Is it somehow helpful? Is it personal? How would you put it?
So if I say a partial yes to it being personal, that is not at all in the kind of separation of the public from the private sphere and the religious belonging to the private sphere.
Right.
It is from a kind of relational understanding of, as I said early on in the conversation, the what's worth doing question is going to be answered contextually and relationally from where you find yourself rather than from above on behalf of everyone. I see. I mean, in a sense, yes, when I speak about the cultural, I almost take it for granted that the sacred is part of the weave of that. I mean, religion as a concept is at best 8 or 9 centuries old. And really, in the way we tend to be using it, barely more than a century and a half old. It's a kind of 19th century project of going around the world, looking at everyone else, and then sort of describing their weave of how they inhabit the world as if it's a kind of deficient version of 19th century Protestant Christianity. And then you end up with this map of the world's religions, and that is not necessarily helpful. But yes, I think that you can't. You're going to get thrown back on the things that humans have always had tight within the weave of our ways of making life work. And whilst the frame of religion to describe and analyze it is not always that helpful, a relationship to the sacred is certainly one of those kind of commonplaces. And a lot of the ways in which modernity has looked like a departure from all the ways that people have lived before, and during its heroic phase could narrate that as because we've outgrown them. Some of those are going to be things that look like temporary weird deviations before a reversion to norm, I think, in almost any imaginable human future.
That last bit I didn't fully grasp, just because otherwise I was with you. But what did you mean at the end by the temporary sort of aberrations, the things that won't look quite right?
So, if you look at the sort of high modern story of having outgrown, whether it's religion or whatever else that anthropologists will quickly show you is found everywhere else and everywhere else. The sort of high modern story of that was a kind of confident, yes, we're different to the ways that humans have been human before, because humanity has now grown up and no longer needs these childish things. And
and we know that's not in fact the case, at least not in that version of it.
You and I would probably agree on that.
No, I agree. And also, I mean, there's just for the empiricist among us, Pew Research, a global data company, something north of 80%, I think even north of 90% identify as religious worldwide, which is not at all to absolve religion of various historical crimes, but it is a way of saying that, a relationship to the sacred being at the heart of culture is quite normal. And that's also not to say that the sacred necessarily unites people. It can also divide them, which is why it's complicated. But with that, I'll let go of my questions. And relinquish the responsibility a little bit to ask Dougald things and pass it over to everyone who's joined us. Who would like to go first? I'll look at the gallery. You can put your hand up. There's the number is such that it would be useful if you put the actual hand up in the Google function, but I can see Esther already, and I don't see any reason not to start with Esther. So Esther, do you want to unmute yourself? I believe I can unmute you, can I? No, I can't. Michael, you'll have to do that. Thank you.
I think I'm okay now. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So this is basically for Dougald, because you were talking about creating conditions of possibility. I hope that's the right phrase. And you told that some of the people you talked to were Tai Chi teachers, which resonates with me. And my experience is that the creating of the conditions of possibility is to start, and then there are all kinds of things that need to go on after that. To materialize these possibilities, they have to have space to grow, and you also have to keep on feeling in. You have to keep on aligning with the world as it is. So, and I actually recently had an experience that taught me that these things are actually easier when you're feeling wounded, when you're feeling vulnerable, and like there's a crack there, something to it actually easier, more possible to feel in and make contact and make space if
you're wounded.
If you're wounded.
If you're
yes.
wounded. Okay, thank you, Esther. Dougald, you can quote Leonard Cohen, and if you don't, I will. But go ahead and try and answer that.
Thanks, Esther. Yeah, thanks for helping us sort of flesh out a bit what creating conditions of possibility might mean and what else might need to be added to a sort of a different account of agency, or some different accounts of agency. There's a story that I tell in the post that Perspecteeva shared last week about my friend Reed Wildermuth describing this tree planting going on pasture land on the farm behind his house in rural Luxembourg, and his kind of gradual horror as he realized that the project had funded the planting of the trees, but no attention, no ongoing involvement with them. And so absolutely, when I talk about creating conditions of possibility, I suppose partly I'm thinking about, like, how do we begin to connect this up to releasing resources that could help things scale out rather than scale up. But what has to be scaling out is living culture, is practices of presence and relationship and showing up and ongoing involvement, rather than the kind of make a plan on a spreadsheet and project it from there onto the ground logic, which Scott describes so well in Seeing Like a State, and which is embodied in that contemporary example of the tree planting project. And yeah, I mean, I think vulnerability and the sort of the crack that lets the light in, to echo Leonard Cohen. Yes, and there's definitely, we are always vulnerable. To be vulnerable means to be capable of being wounded. We're embodied creatures. And a lot of where the kind of attempting to see the world through a spreadsheet and then kind of manage it from above through a spreadsheet comes from is, at some level, a desire to insulate ourselves against that vulnerability. A lot of the logics of modernity are rooted in, certainly Vanessa Machado de Oliveira would say this, rooted first in a separation from our metabolic participation in the life of the world, which we might also think of at a metaphysical as well as a physical level. So firstly, you have this kind of separation, severance from an experience of that. And then out of that arise new kind of insecurities based on our vulnerability. And then defenses are erected against those insecurities. And then those defenses are elevated until they become entitlements. And that's part of how you arrive at the world that many of us were born into as the winners of modernity, is through that layered process that has its deep roots in this severing from an experience of being a part of the world. And so in our vulnerability and in the moments where we experience our vulnerability, in the moments of being wounded, we're called back into relation to that. There's a difference between a wound and a scar. A scar is a sign both that a wound has happened and that healing has taken place. And I sort of came to realize at a certain point in time that there are experiences in our lives which, while they're still wounds, are not capable of being offered as a gift to anyone else. But once they become scars, become a gift that can be offered. And so there's a sort of both and to the power of our vulnerability and our experience of woundedness in being something that can bring so much to the table, which is that, if we're still in a position where what we need is help staunching the blood flow, then it can be a mistake for us to try to be being a blood donor at the same moment. But nonetheless, we are changed by our wounds. And if we're allowed to wear them rather than hide them, they can be part of what allows us to show up in a world that's calling us back to vulnerability, which is very much what I would be trying to speak for. So thank you for inviting that, Esther.
Wonderful. Thank you, Esther. And thank you for the answer also. I think, Chuck, you were next, if you want to go next.
Thank you. I'm in the United States. I'm very actively involved with a school in Virginia called Springhouse. It's a school both for teenagers 13 to 18 and adults who are interested in developing similar situations. Their focus is vitality, what brings you alive. They're heavily influenced by the work of Bill Plotkin. Don't know if you're aware of him, Nature and the Human Soul, and a general acknowledgement of mystery, heavily influenced by David Bohm's Implicate Order, as recently described by Jude Currivan in The Cosmic Hologram and The Story of Gaia. And I'm just wondering two things. Number one, are those also influences of yours, people like Bill Plotkin and Jude Currivan? And two, do you know of other schools, actual places that are in the same kind of space?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Chuck. So Plotkin and Bohm are both sort of names to me, but not people whose work I've spent a lot of time with. But they're names to me because I've been around people to whom they have mattered a great deal. So I immediately understand from the people I've known who've been influenced by them why those might be influences around which to constitute such a school. I think it'd be really interesting to, maybe people can put examples into the chat of other schools that match your question there. I don't have a lot off the top of my head to offer. I mean, the kinds of schools that we were inspired by for what we're doing here are the quite small schools that are kind of mostly, if not exclusively, for grown-ups, like Martin Shaw's West Country School of Myth and Story, Stephen Jenkinson's Orphan Wisdom School, and sort of actually out the back of those, perhaps less well known, is Martin Prechtel's Bolad's Kitchen in New Mexico. And for me, particularly kind of having known Martin for quite a long time and observed the way that school has been the kind of platform for the development of his work, Anna and I wanted to create something that would start from and return to the spirit of the conversations that we anyway convene around our kitchen table. And there was a a sense that there might be a clue in the sort of flourishing and liveliness that I've observed in those kind of tiny schools, domestic scale schools, that they reflect perhaps a kind of turning of the wheel that also belongs to this moment that we've been talking about, where, if you like, I mean, maybe some of you are familiar with Weber's sort of three types of authority. And you sort of have, charismatic, and then traditional, and then legal bureaucratic authority. And that's often kind of stacked up as a kind of three-step progressive layer. But if we thought of it almost more like a turning wheel, like Aristotle's three forms of government, that we're in a moment where, although the resources are still with the legal bureaucratic forms of institution, the cultural energy has already departed and is with, for want of a better word, charismatic forms of institution. And modernity has lots of stories to tell us about why that's a bad thing, and why charismatic authority is always and automatically a toxic thing. But it might be more helpful to look, and the person who first put me on this path was, I don't think he meant to, but was Alistair McIntosh, with the early draft of the book that became the Spiritual Activism Handbook that he co-authored. And he sent that to me back in 2003. And what struck me in that was it was a very careful, thoughtful piece of work by somebody who had found himself, by virtue of the fact that the institute that he was running, the centre he was running within Edinburgh University, was shut down by the university. Its members decided to just keep running it anyway. He found himself running something which was under attack for being, reliant on dangerous charismatic authority. Oh, this is the cult of Alistair McIntosh, rather than respectable legal bureaucratic institutional authority. And so he, being Alistair, went into the research on cults and went to look at, like, okay, what do we need to attend to in our accountability to ensure that we don't manifest a toxic form of charismatic authority? And so the Spiritual Activism Handbook feels to me like a forerunner for a responsible way of operating as these kind of small scale, more charismatic micro institutions that I think might have a part to play in the kind of times that we're in.
Thank you, Dougald. We have three other hands up. Just encourage you to mobilize your question now before we run out of time. So if you haven't already, don't wait too long because now is your chance. I'm gonna, if you can, Niels, Chris, and Benjamin, will take you in turn, and just because we're keen to get all of you, but also get a good answer and get someone else in, if you could keep your question as succinct and to the point as possible. I'm not sure who put their hand up first, but Benjamin, will begin with you if that's okay. If you can hear me. You seem to have disappeared. So we'll begin with Chris and come back to Benjamin.
Hi. I was taken with what you were talking about the land dreaming of being a forest. And it relates to me to ideas about the earth dreaming. And I've had this fantasy for a long time of the wounded earth. The earth is a wounded and potentially healing planet. So I guess my question is, does any of that relate to your thinking? And I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's interesting to me to think about the specificity of land dreaming as it's been experienced in many cultures and related to in many cultures, and the influence of the sort of the icon of the whole earth, the earth as seen from space, within environmentalism and within late modernity. And Ivan Illich, who I learnt so much from, almost says at the end of Deschooling Society, getting to the moon was the easy part, it's finding our way home that's hard. And that's written at the beginning of the 1970s when, people going to the moon was actually a thing that happened rather than something that's now historical for most of the humans alive. And I would encourage people to have a look at Rob Lewis's work. The Climate According to Life is his Substack, as a poet who's been working with scientists to look for what goes missing when we only tell the global story of climate change and when we only tell the global story of what climate is. And that something about the role of the local and the specific and climates, plural, got sort of factored out because the computer modeling couldn't handle it part the way along the journey into our current understanding of climate change. And I've learned a lot from reading Rob, and when he was with us in the series at our school that I taught on Zoom in the spring, I think there was some really interesting kind of dialogue with other participants around how this relates to seeking a relationship to place and land in the specific, after having kind of come out of a generation of environmentalism that was very focused on the earth, the fragile earth, that kind of extraordinary, beautiful, powerful image. And I'm not saying that there's nothing to be done with the relation to, the earth as a whole dreaming. I'm just saying I feel very, very small in relation to the earth as a whole, but I am slowly coming into relation with the land in this bit of Sweden where I expect surprises aside to live out the rest of my life and one day be buried.
Dougald, can I just follow up on that, because it's such a big divergence among people I speak to in the space that perspecteeva is part of. There is a presumptuous planetization in a lot of the talk around what we need to do and the situation and so on. And it has an empirical basis, as you know, because as you mentioned, it's measured now. The Earth can be seen as one system. There's planetary boundaries and so on. On the other hand, a lot of the hope and a lot of the more exciting, innovative work seems much more modest and local and human. And I find it quite difficult to reconcile these things, because part of me thinks it won't make any difference. There's the so-called Jevons paradox, and lots of things that look like they're progress at one scale are actually shown to be not so on another. I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that, because it's such a big issue.
I like that phrase, presumptuous planetization. I'm going to remember that. I was thinking of Wolfgang Sachs's book, I think it's called Planet Dialectics. And he was part of the circle around Illich, and he went into all of this. I think that McGilchrist might be helpful to us again in the sense that the trouble with the planetization is the left hemisphere will want to stay at that level of zoomed outness, and think that it's done all of the work of knowing that is needed.
Right.
Whereas, that kind of knowledge that requires distance and actually huge amounts of technology, it has its place, but it needs to find a humbler place, which is why the kind of thing that I allege Illich to almost be saying about finding our way home being the hard part of the work,
right,
is the challenge. That finding our way home is actually, the bringing back into the kind of the relation, the two sides, in Ian's way of describing how we got here.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think that's good. And yeah, the McGilchrist angle on that is quite helpful, which I'll come back to. So we've just a little time left, and it was good Benjamin, you're suddenly appearing and colorfully so. I'm going to go Benjamin, then Niels, and then I see Lee has also got her hand up. So if you can, again, keep it reasonably succinct, it would really help at this stage of the event, both because we're short of time and people will be beginning to flag. So Benjamin first, please. What's your question?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'm coming up on a transition in my life. I already went through a pretty big transition after I learned about a lot of this stuff. I interned at a big bank and stuff in college, but now I'm working on a no-till farm and I'm currently harvesting carrots. And my employment on the farm is coming to an end at the end of the year. And I think I have the opportunity to go back into something approximating the corporate world in the next several steps. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice as far as being mindful of staying caught in the paradigms of modernity and kind of the allure of rugged individualism and all that sort of stuff versus taking a route that focuses maybe more so on a place in particular and social capital and things of that nature, and kind of walking that tightrope, so to speak, I guess.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Benjamin. Do just hold that thought. It's only 3 questions, so I think we can hold them all. Niels, you asked wonderful questions, but if I can ask you to keep it reasonably to the point, please.
Yes, I shall try. I have a knowledge and vision of combining that the spiritual is the same model as a mechanical model. So that's where I am. So my vision is that we need to raise the level of consciousness. That is the main issue, because if you can raise the consciousness level for the left hemisphere, then we begin to merge. And if they understand the benefit of the right hemisphere, then that would be a good point to start teaching and learning. And that's my
your perspective.
And this is not hubris, but I've spent over 30 years trying to explain this to people. And the sad thing is that it's so simple.
Right.
It's like the 2 hemisphere is the same mechanism that optimizes those in terms of finding all the pathways, if you like, all the opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Niels. Sorry.
Yeah,
didn't want to cut you off, but I can get the gist of that question, I think, for Dougald. And then Lee, finally, what's your question, please?
Yes.
So I was thinking, when you were speaking about the importance of recognizing that everything is being mediated through culture, by culture, along those lines, I was wondering, maybe in 2 parts, the sort of cultural specificity that we might talk about between countries, between regions of the world, and how you bring that into your thinking as well in your work. And then the other part of it is thinking about culture in terms of like cultural expression and artistic forms, and sort of how does that also then play into your work? And I think that those are 2 slightly different things. So if you can speak to both of them, I would love to hear that.
Okay, marvelously, thank you. So Dougald, you've got career advice for a man about to make a big decision, transformation of consciousness, yes or no, and cultural change, integration, multifaceted question about culture for you to answer. Go.
Wow. Thanks, everyone. What an amazing mix of questions to bring. I'm thinking about, moments of making choices and turnings in life. And, on the one hand, something that, again, like so much else, I learned from Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, where she talks about the sort of fantasy of divestment that often comes to us at the point where shit gets real to us, when we realize how deep the trouble is, and we want to somehow extract ourselves from being bound up with, implicated in, what has suddenly become, very visible to us in a way that it maybe wasn't before. And she says, to the extent that we get close to realizing that, we're simply demonstrating quite how privileged we are within the mess. Versus what she suggests instead, which is disinvestment, which is slowing down and paying attention and, staying involved, or being aware of the ways in which we're going to be staying involved with systems that are part of why the world is in this mess. whilst no longer believing in the promises around which those systems are structured, and looking for what becomes possible, whether it's in terms of contributing to damage limitation, looking for the places where you're on the edge of something where it's possible to tilt it in a different direction, or to experiment with something in a corner or a pocket within an existing system. So all of those are things that would be sort of on my mind in terms of making choices and life paths, and also just in terms of how we get back involved with land and food and place and soil. Like somehow part of this work of making good ruins and mobilizing resources from players within the existing system that have recognized that its story is coming to an end has to involve both what I've heard Carl Fainson talking about in terms of she's talking about a sort of idea for the Great Letting Go Fund, which is about actually resourcing both individuals and organizations to go on a journey that releases them from having to carry on with activities that are clearly not contributing anything to the conditions of possibility for worlds worth living in, and building up skills and involvement with land and food and place and community. And there's something in that. And then the other end of it has to be around land ownership and tenure. And there again, I'd want to sort of defer to bringing together people like Chris Smage and others who really have some of the kinds of grasp and vision and experience of the realities of small-scale agriculture as something that can play a big part in how we make lives worth living in the decades ahead. To look at, if you were able to release a significant amount of resources into making land available for the kinds of agriculture that Chris and others, Vandana Shiva is someone else I've been in dialogue with who's obviously very involved in this from an Indian perspective, but also internationally. If you were, what would be the right forms of holding of land to contribute to the conditions of possibility for young people who want to get involved in and make lives that are shaped around ongoing involvement with land and place, food growing and community to do so. Those to me are the things that are kind of coming over my horizon now as I begin to see that there's a sort of strategic layer to this kind of work that I've been talking about.
See that Benjamin is actually, as we speak,
I know.
I don't know if those are ruins or not. They don't look like ruins, but he's certainly working.
He's eating carrots.
Yeah, he's certainly walking the talk for us.
Thank you.
Ben, did you get that answer? I'm not sure he can hear us or not, but he'll get the recording later. But anyway, that's the good on the first one. On the how do you do with the language of transformation of consciousness? I mean, I know you know Ian's work, and they're sort of separate questions in some ways, but this language abounds in our space.
It does.
Some people give it a lot of intellectual dignity, and some just use it rhetorically. But what does it mean to you?
I'm a bit cautious around it. Just simply at the level that it's never particularly been language that I have found the need or the use for in my own work. And it sometimes seems to be showing up within a kind of linear periodization of, or kind of ranking of, different groups of humans that can be redolent of a rather 19th century racist way of describing everyone that was in the 20th century kind of bred straight into the kind of dominant and still quite respectable development thinking that structured international development from the end of the 40s onwards. And so the sort of when the development of consciousness language is kind of being deployed in ways where I see Sweden being up at the top right on some chart that shows that the society I'm currently and have made my home in is closer to the future and more advanced than everyone else. I just want to sit down and have a conversation about all that can be seen. And, about the conversation I had on Saturday with my Syrian friend who arrived here 10 years ago and who I met in Swedish for Immigrants class, about the things that he can see and the things that we can see when we sit down and compare notes about the lacks within this society, the things that have been lost on the way to the future by the world's most modern country. Right. So, for those reasons, I have a bit of a kind of caution around the way that I see this language often being deployed. And yet that may well have, not a great deal to do with what it's doing for some people and the ways in which it's giving you a vocabulary to talk helpfully about, as the questioner said, about, not treating the sort of spiritual and the mechanical as if they're vastly off in different realms, but that they might actually speak to each other, which I certainly, some of the people who I learned the most from spiritually were very kind of pragmatic in their ability to use their kind of parts of themselves that were engineers to offer ways of talking about the spiritual technology of different times and places. So I'm not completely averse to the idea that we might bring those seemingly very different things together in ways that might be helpful.
Okay, great. And just to put a quick word in there that although the term transformation of consciousness is often abused and misused, it can be used and fleshed out in ways that are more or less rigorous. The meaning of transformation, for example, can be fleshed out. The form can have its own ontology and be something to do with a subject-object relationship. And consciousness, of course, can be seen as an ontological primary, and yada yada yada. You can begin to describe, sort of when Ian McGilchrist says that we need to balance the hemispheres and make the culture somewhat more sympathetic to the right hemisphere and for the right hemisphere to lead again in some sense. That could be one version, but only one version of what is meant by it.
Transformation of consciousness could mean. Absolutely. And I mean, you've probably seen that there's Ian and I went to stay with Ian the day that my book was published and spent a couple of nights there, and we recorded a conversation together, which was very fruitful. And it was lovely to sort of be relatively late to his work and realize that he had mapped out from a totally different place and in an extraordinary and impressive way some stuff that I'd been sketching in a much humbler way from my own experience and fields of knowledge.
And lastly, Dougald, you began there by parsing culturally what close knowledge of a culture can give you in terms of international comparisons. So Lee's question, I don't know, Lee, if you want to ask it again or if I can paraphrase it.
No, I think you're allowed to paraphrase. I was just remarking that you started answering that question, in fact, by starting with the anecdote that you did about your Syrian friend. And I think that gets at for me, a bit of what I was curious about, of how that shows up in your life, but also your work.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah. So, I mean, I've mentioned Illich at various points in this conversation, and I did a recent appearance on Gordon White's Rune Soup, where I spoke to him in some detail about Ivan Illich. One of the things that's sort of central in his work was he ran this center in the 60s and early 70s in Cuernavaca in Mexico that was called the Center for Intercultural Documentation. And when he set that up, he was still a Catholic priest and still an active Catholic priest. And it was being set up as a place where, from his point of view, what he was doing was taking the missionaries who were going to be being sent from North America and Europe to Latin America in this new modernizing missionary drive at the beginning of the 60s, and either convincing them that they were wrong about their vocation or making sure that they understood how much they had to learn from the people that they were going to rather than just to teach them. Adam Wilson wrote a piece recently based on an experience he'd had at Stephen Jenkinson's school, where they'd been looking at this text of one of the earliest, missionary encounters in the very beginnings of sort of European transatlantic encounters 500 years ago, where Stephen was speaking with his students about the sort of the tragic glimpsing of something that was going on in the missionary's account of this other culture that he was encountering, and the lost possibility of that moment in which that intercultural encounter could have, woken something that had gone missing within Christianity and within European culture, And I think Illich was very much, as a Christian, animated by a sense of the radical possibility of intercultural encounter to be the moment where you are reminded of how much has gone wrong, gone dead, gone missing along the way on the journey that your own culture has been on. There's an essay that I was using with the participants in our current...
Just 1 minute, Dougal, just to round up, yeah.
Yeah, there's an essay that I was using last week from a man called Jamie Moran that's called The Gift. It's called The Blessing and the Poison of Human Culture. And that idea that culture is both gift and can become poison or can become trap. And that all of us, need the moments where we're shaken out of our assumptions within our own culture. And that doesn't just apply to the strange kind of end of modernity moment that we are, most of us, arriving from, but it's something that's always been part of the ongoing life and work of culture, is its renewal through collisions and encounters, rather than modernity has this kind of fantasy of traditional culture as something unchanging that has been projected as the other to modernity on its journey to the future, which has little to do with the ways in which human beings and human cultures have made life work in other times and places. So those are just a few of the many things I can say about culture.
Great. Listen, thank you. You can tell Dougald could talk forever, and we'd listen forever, I think. But we have to draw this particular event to a close. For those of you who are new to the community, we do have a mighty network, and we'll try and continue the discussion there. It may or may not kick off, the speed at which it kicks off is to be determined, but we in principle will carry on. If you have questions and things you want to discuss, that's the place to do it. I would encourage you to buy Dougald's book, At Work in the Ruins, and to follow him on Substack. And for now, it just remains for me to thank him very much for joining us, and we hope we can get him back before too long. Thank you, Dougald.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone. It's been lovely to be with you.
Sure.